Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. More information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 31,680 people from 159 countries, and is supported by 446 organizations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts engaged in defending women's rights. This week, I'm really pleased to say we have Christina Ellingsen from Norway, and she's going to talk about being investigated by the police after Amnesty International Norway complained about a tweet saying men can't be a mother. Dansky from the USA is going to talk on the WDI USA statement on What is a Woman, which is a film that has come out about the fight against gender identity ideology, but she's going to explain some background on it and what the US chapter of WDI thinks about this. Next, we're going to have Frances Smootz. She's from Germany. She's the country contact for WDI in Germany, and she's going to give us an update on the incident with Eva Engelken of the German Greens and the latest happenings in Germany. And then we have Stefanie Davies-Arai from the UK, who has recently been awarded a British Empire Medal. And Stefanie is the founder of Transgender Trend. So we'll hear about the work of Transgender Trend and also the significance of this award, this sort of recognition of the importance of her work. We're going to hear from Christina Ellingsen. She is the country contact for WDI in Norway. She is being investigated by the police after Amnesty International Norway complained about a tweet saying a man can't be a mother. Thank you so much for talking to us, Christina. There's so much publicity about this, and this is such a significant moment, and you're being so brave and creative and brilliant about it. But over to you.
I do not believe that men who say they are women, girls, mothers, or lesbians are what they claim to be. And it turns out in Norway, making a statement like that is considered, potentially considered a hate crime. And so I'm currently being investigated for having made statements on Twitter. After Norway passed a law that came into effect this January last year, which gave the concept of gendered identities legal protection in our Norwegian hate crime laws. So I'm just going to try to explain a little bit about my background and how I ended up in this situation. So my background is that in 2008, I finished my studies in critical theory. And at the time, I was about 20 years old, like in my early 20s. And I thought, well, you know, critical theory and queer theory, you know, it really, to me, it was really interesting. And then 10 years later, I decided to do another degree, and this time in engineering, in biotechnology. So I had then two different kind of approaches to like how society would approach biology. And then one afternoon, I had an afternoon to spare. And then I thought, well, how's things going in critical theory? I'll just, you know, how are, you know, what's the discourses? What's the mood? So I went on a little Google search, and then what I discovered was that women were being censored all over the internet for saying there's a difference between sex and gender, that Jessica and Eve couldn't have a period because he was male, and that lesbians everywhere were saying men can't be lesbians. And the whole thing just seemed completely bizarre to me. So I started investigating, and then I was just completely shocked. I was just completely shocked because the theories that I've been sort of, you know, I've looked at the theories I'd studied in 2008 that I thought was kind of like interesting theoretical approaches was being put into practice, and women were complaining about it everywhere. And nobody seemed to care. Nobody cared. So I kind of fell into this rabbit hole that I think a lot of the women here today have experienced, where you just kind of tumble down and you can't believe what you're seeing. Like, women are trying to explain that men who claim to be women, they're still just men, and they pose the same risks as every other man. And most significantly, all the rights that women and feminists have fought for the last 100 years, which have been developed to protect women from discrimination on the basis of sex, those rights were just being exchanged with this weird concept of gendered identities. So after having had a few encounters with trigger-happy teenagers and really easily insulted 60-year-old men, I realized that this is actually a really significant problem, because it's not possible to have a public debate about the consequences of replacing an objective definition of sex with this subjective definition of, you know, this weird concept like gendered identities. And then I realized it was the same problem. Well, at least the way I saw it, it seemed like it was the same problem in every industrial country. Like in Britain, lesbians were saying men can't be lesbians. And there was like a demonized lesbian in every country. And in Norway, that lesbian was Tonje Gjevjon. She's a lesbian artist, writer, and musician. People were just comparing her to like somebody calling for genocide. Well, anyway, because it's the way I saw it, the way I see it, it's like the changes to the understanding of what sex and biology and gender is happening on two fronts. One is legal and one is cultural. So I got together with Tonje Gjevjon, and then all the women I could find that was aware of the situation. And we made two different platforms to approach this problem in order to kind of try to sort of force some space in so that we could have a proper discussion. One of those is a platform called The Matriarch. It's a platform where women are invited to make anonymous statements where they can be as unfiltered as they want to, where they can be as angry as they want to, and as clear, and try to find the words to describe how they experience being reduced to a feeling that a man can have. And then the other approach was promoting the work of Women's Declaration International and this incredible tool, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So I have I manage 3 social media accounts. One is for WDI Norway, one is for The Matriarch, and one is my personal account. And then for the legal aspects, this kind of WDI approach, we have contacted politicians. The video you're seeing in the background now, we went to the Cultural and Equality Ministers' open meeting for the Labour Party's gay network. And we formulated a very specific question to her, asking her, in light of how women's rights include lesbian rights and women's rights are based on biological sex, would she clarify that lesbians don't have a penis and work to ensure that lesbian women's rights were upheld in her new position as an equality minister. And her answer was just bizarre. She says, not only does she not share the belief that biological sex is relevant, but she even warned us not to approach this as some kind of feminist issue. So she didn't answer our question at all. She straight out said that she was willing to ignore women's human rights in order to push forward with this identity politics that literally erases women's rights. So that's the kind of legal approach that we've done. And then on the cultural approach, basically I've let Tonje Jevjon, the lesbian artist, have free reign on this platform, the Matriarch platform. And then last year, they proposed to include gendered identities as a protected characteristics, or not even protected characteristics, because in Norway, we don't protect characteristics. In Norway, we protect groups. We've developed this completely bizarre approach where our discrimination laws are not there in order to ensure that nobody is discriminated against to be able to enjoy the same universal rights as everybody else. No, in Norway, we have created the system where groups of people have specific rights depending on what kind of group they belong to, which is a very different approach than what I understand both England and the UN are doing in terms of discrimination laws. And in this scenario, in the way that we have it here in Norway, because it's based on which group you belong to, women are not considered a group that that needs protection because we're not a minority, and a heterosexual man can, with one statement of saying that he's a woman, change group from being the most privileged person, belonging to the most privileged group in the world, if you're following this kind of group mentality, from being the most privileged person, group in the world, to becoming both a sexual minority, a gender minority, and then in Norway, the gender kind of gurus, they consider themselves belonging to an indigenous people. So they kind of get from one statement, they become like this thrice protected, thrice vulnerable group, even though, of course, they are still men, men from the richest country in the world. It's just bizarre. Anyway, very quickly after the law that introduced gender identity into the hate crime laws, well, I warned them and I said, you can't introduce this concept because it is per definition a subjective belief. And if we introduce subjective beliefs into our laws, we are essentially reintroducing blasphemy laws. And we know that these laws will be exploited by these activists because they are desperate. They are already desperately trying to sue women for hate speech and for harassment, just by making basic statements about what biology is and what sex is and what women's rights are. And of course, they started immediately to collect all our statements, all my statements, both from the WDI Norway account, my personal account, and then the Matriarch account, resulting in a report now consisting of such a massive amount of tweets that it's just insane. Every single statement that I've made for the last year are now being investigated by the police as a potential hate crime. It's insane. It's just also bizarre because, a lot of our tweets are really funny. We're not allowed to have any sense of humor, apparently. Like, women are not allowed to be funny. Like, Tonje has written some tweets that are just like hilarious. Like, we're laughing so much about, and also it's very serious. which is basically just saying again and again and again, a lesbian can't have a penis. And it's harassment to allow men to claim they are lesbians. But we're not supposed to be funny. We're not supposed to be, clever. We're not allowed to be anything. And at the same time, our equality minister has participated in satire movies portraying women as birthing people, being impregnated by farts. I'm not kidding. Like, that's one of the satire movies that our equality minister has been a part of. But anyway, this case will be very important, regardless of what the outcome is. I have essentially been running a campaign. I'm trying to I'm reminding an audience, especially an audience of women, that women are female. We have human rights. Those rights are developed for a reason, and they have a specific function and purpose. And that purpose is to mitigate the risks and the risks surrounding being a member of the female sex of the human population. And to replace those laws with laws pertaining to men's ideas, something that men can fantasize about, it means that we will be forced to accept men's personal convictions, regardless of whether or not we believe in them. And women must have the right to denounce men's convictions, no matter what those convictions are, but especially if those convictions are about what a woman is and what a woman should or should not do. So that is, basically a rundown of my situation, or our situation, as it has developed in Norway.
And we're now going to go to Kara Dansky. So Kara Dansky is the president of WDI USA, a very well-known attorney and author of the fantastic book, The Abolition of Sex, which was published at the beginning of this year. And if you haven't read it, highly recommend you read it. It's a really, I would say it is the best book published in the last 2 years on this issue. And it's not just a rundown of what's happening and although it is, it's incredibly interesting insight into American law, but also into feminist politics. It's just brilliant. So, but anyway, we're not talking about that now. We're talking about what's happening with this film. So over to you, Kara.
So I'm going to be talking about the recent film, What is a Woman? So on June 1st, 2022, the Daily Wire produced a film featuring Christian conservative traditionalist Matt Walsh. The title of the film was What is a Woman? And it mostly involved Walsh going around the world and asking various people, including both experts on sex and gender and ordinary people on the street, that very question. Over the course of the hour and a half, no one appears to be able to answer it. Finally, at the end of the film, Walsh's wife answers the question in a manner that we would all recognize when she says adult human female. I'd like to take some time here to explain who Walsh is and whether there were any feminists involved in the production of the film, and to place the film in context, given the state of political play regarding matters of sex and gender in the States today. Then I'll read the statement that the US chapter of Women's Declaration International put out following the film's release. The Daily Wire is an American conservative news website and media company founded in 2015 by commentator Ben Shapiro. Shapiro is an extremely intelligent and also extremely conservative man who detests feminism. It is funded in large part by billionaires and fracking executives, all men. Matt Walsh has a show on the Daily Wire called The Matt Walsh Show. Matt Walsh has had a few things to say about feminists and feminism on Twitter, and here I'm quoting him. The first one, feminism has become the most vacuous and useless movement known to humanity. These women are desperate to be oppressed, but sadly for them, they live in the freest and most prosperous country on earth, so they spend their time inventing boogeymen to fight. 2, he says, feminism is rotten at the core. Each wave led inexorably to the next. There is no good feminism. It's one of the worst things to ever happen to Western civilization. 3, he says, there really is no creature on earth more repulsive than a bitter old boomer pro-abortion feminist. These people are just absolute heinous monsters. They've overseen the slaughter of 60 million children and still aren't satisfied. Bloodthirsty psychopaths. Those are just a few of the things that Walsh has had to say about feminists and feminism. Walsh clearly is no friend to feminism. It is presumably for this reason that he did not invite any radical feminists to participate in the film. He stated on Twitter that he had invited several of the most prominent feminists to participate, and they all declined. I think that he's using his words very advisedly here. He is saying very prominent feminists because he knows that radical feminists are not prominent in the US. Most likely, in my view, he invited the leaders of groups like the National Organization for Women and Planned Parenthood, both of which yell that trans women are women on a regular basis, knowing that they would say no. That way, when the inevitable backlash from actual feminists came, he could say that he invited prominent feminists. It's probably true that he invited women who most of us would refer to as liberal feminists. I can only say with certainty that he did not invite anyone from WDI USA to participate. Many have hailed the movie as a success, and I understand why. As our chapter explains in our statement, which I'll read in a minute, the film does a number of things effectively. A lot of these proponents of the project take Walsh at his word when he says that he invited so-called prominent feminists and speculate that maybe he just doesn't know about actual radical feminists who might be inclined to agree with him about gender identity. That is wrong. Walsh knows exactly where to find the radical feminists. I know this because when my book was published in November 2021, the book publicist reached out to both Walsh and the Daily Wire several times, requesting interviews. Those requests went unanswered. Several months later, I DM'd Walsh on Twitter, no response. At one point on Twitter, he engaged with me. I told him that I'd like to go on his show to talk, and he declined, stating that his podcast format does not lend itself to interviews. During our Twitter back and forth, it became abundantly clear to me that he knows who I am and that he had simply been ignoring me the entire time. More recently, he tweeted that he would be happy to work with anyone who can help take down gender ideology, and I responded, great, let's talk. I DM'd him again, and this time he responded to say that he was willing to talk in a public forum. I asked if he's able to get us a spot on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he said he could not, and that is as far as the conversation has gone to date. As a political matter, I don't really think that Walsh is important to the fight to push back against gender ideology in the US. The reason that I think that is that the critical demographic that American radical feminists need to reach if we're going to win is mainstream liberals. Most mainstream American liberals think that gender identity is nonsense as soon as they understand what it actually is. The problem for us is that most of them have no idea what it is because the American media deliberately keeps them in the dark. I have said before that if radical feminists, lesbian rights activists, and biologists can be heard, we will win. And I continue to think that is true. No mainstream American liberal is going to be persuaded by a production in the Daily Wire featuring a Christian conservative traditionalist that contains no sane leftist voices at all. So I don't think we need men like Matt Walsh fighting these battles. However, although we don't need men like him, we're stuck with him. If I could blink my eyes and make him disappear from the scene, I would do that. But I don't have the power to do that. Walsh is going to remain on the scene. To the extent that he is going to remain on the scene then, what Americans like WDI USA need to do is figure out how to use his platform to advance our message. We know that this is not ideal, but as long as he's going to be around, I intend to make sure that he's useful. Which brings me to the final point I want to make about the current political climate on sex and gender in the US. There are many conservative individuals and organizations in the States that understand the value that leftist feminists bring to the discussion. Groups like WDI USA and Wolf have spent years cultivating some very positive relationships with some of them. They understand that if the fight is always framed as being the big bad Christian American right on one side and an allegedly marginalized community on the other side, the right is going to lose. And so they use us. They bring us into meetings and they platform our voices. When I say that I'm a lifelong Democrat who brings a leftist feminist critique of gender identity, it's harder for Democrats to ignore me than it is for Democrats to ignore the conservatives. This is, of course, precisely why the media shuts us completely out of the conversation. To date, Walsh has been either unable or unwilling to grasp this political reality. He may not understand it, or he may understand it and not care. I don't know. My assumption has been that he does not want to platform us because he is reluctant to acknowledge that feminists have accomplished something of value and that we actually have good ideas. So we'll just have to wait and see whether he makes good on his offer to have a public discussion and to work together. I know that there are going to be loads of women who are going to be very angry with us if we share a platform with Walsh. But if we can use his money and his access to spread our message, why wouldn't we do that? So with that, here's our chapter statement about the film. Matt Walsh's new film, What is a Woman, produced by the Daily Wire, is in some ways a valuable contribution to the bipartisan movement to fight back against the inclusion of so-called gender identity in law and throughout society. It is also a celebration of sex stereotypes. Matt Walsh clearly loves sex stereotypes. The first few minutes of the film consist of a practically orgasmic celebration of girls liking pink dolls and glitter and boys liking blue trucks and guns. It ends with his wife, clad in a bathrobe and washing the dishes in the kitchen, stating that a woman is an adult human female and asking for his help in opening a jar of pickles. He goes on to open the jar, clearly quite impressed with his own virility. The film does one thing really well. It exposes the absurdity of the fact that no one seems to be able to define what a woman is. Walsh does this with humor and insight. His on-the-street interviews with strangers are a mixed bag. Most likely, a lot of the people he encounters don't have any idea why he is asking, what is a woman, because they're not enmeshed in the gender wars. Many of them seem to be genuinely surprised and not to understand the point of the question, but many of them answer along the lines of, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. And part of this project's worthy aim is to expose this absurdity. Walsh does a spectacular job in his interviews with so-called experts on topics like sex and gender. And the moment the congressperson ends the interview and walks out is brilliant. The film does something else well. It exposes the lies and the horrors of child transition. Our society, our laws, and our medical establishment are actively engaged in a eugenics project. We are mutilating and sterilizing children. We are all horrified about that and glad that he exposed this vicious industry for what it is. No one has done more to expose the industry than the 11th Hour blog, but nonetheless, the more light that is shed on this travesty, the better. Much ado has been made on social media about Walsh's failure to interview any radical feminists for the project. Many women are very angry that he appears to present himself as a savior in this fight, when women, feminists especially, have been fighting back against the movement to abolish sex for years. We understand this criticism and respect it. One might object by asking, but wait, how do you know that Walsh even knew about the radical feminist objections to gender identity? We know because when WDI USA President Kara Dansky's book, The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls, was published in November 2021, the book publicist repeatedly requested interviews with both Walsh and the Daily Wire. The requests were all ignored. When Kara brought this to Walsh's attention several months ago on Twitter, Walsh engaged with her and responded that his podcast format does not lend itself to interviews. Fair enough, but Walsh can't now say that he didn't know about us when he went about creating his film. We think there's a much bigger problem with Walsh's intentional omission of radical feminist voices, though. It is not that we need Walsh to appreciate the contributions of feminists. He doesn't, and we know that. None of us particularly cares what he thinks of feminists. We already know that he dismisses us. Further, feminists are not angry because their egos got hurt. None of us is interested in fame for fame's sake. Many of us would likely be thrilled to win this battle and then shrink off into obscurity to live out the rest of our lives on the beach or in the mountains. The problem with Matt's failure to include radical feminist voices is that it is a terrible political strategy. The fight against the gender industry, what the 11th Hour blog calls the techno-medical complex, consists of lots of diverse players with different viewpoints and values. That's a good thing. It is well known that radical feminist groups like WDI USA are comfortable working with conservative organizations when it is strategic to do so, and it often is. WDI USA has accomplished a lot by working with conservative organizations, especially women's groups like the Independent Women's Forum and Concerned Women for America, who understand the strategic importance of highlighting leftist radical feminist voices in the fight. These groups understand this. If this political battle consists of the big bad Christian right versus a marginalized group of trans people, women are going to lose. They understand that they need our voices if we collectively are going to win. Matt either doesn't or won't grasp this. We understand the value of this film in exposing things that need to be exposed. We also think that the key demographic in winning this political battle are going to be mainstream liberals who are still in the dark about the dangers of gender identity because the media keeps them there. Most mainstream liberals quickly see through the absurdity of gender identity once it is pointed out to them. We also think that approximately 0 of them are going to be persuaded by or even know about a film produced by the Daily Wire featuring a known Christian conservative traditionalist that omits the leftist feminist critique of gender identity entirely. Many men, including Walsh, know what a woman is because they know exactly upon whose neck to place their boots. We would welcome the opportunity to talk with them to see if they can be persuaded that they need radical feminist voices if they want to win. Until then, they aren't helping. While we were composing this statement, Walsh tweeted this offer to join forces with anyone to bring down gender ideology. WDI USA President Kara Dansky tweeted this, and that's my response, great, let's talk, in response. We'll see if he makes good on his offer. That's the end of the statement. There are some really other interesting reviews available online. Victoria Smith, who goes by Glosswitch on Twitter, has a great review out in The Critic, and Kelly J. Keene reviewed it on her YouTube channel. I'll just end by telling a quick story about a different Matt Taibbi. Taibbi is a fairly prominent voice in US leftist politics. He has written several books and he has a large platform on the US left. He covered the rallies at the US Supreme Court in December 2021 when both pro-abortion and anti-abortion groups appeared during oral arguments in the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health case, the very case that appears to be set to overturn Roe v. Wade. Several signatories to the declaration were there that day to rally in favor of Roe. We held signs that said things like abortion is a women's sex-based right and only women need abortions. We had a megaphone and we used it to chant and sing songs like woman, adult human female, I am a woman. We didn't know it at the time, but his videographer was there, capturing footage of us chanting and singing. A clip later showed up in a piece that he published about the rallies. One of us, Jessica Gonzalez, who has appeared on Feminist Question Time before, happened to know the videographer and sent me his email address. I used that address to get in touch with Taibbi, who eventually agreed to talk with me. He and I talked in January via Zoom. We talked a lot. We talked for hours. He promised me that he would publish our interview. He didn't. Then, just last week, he got back to me. He apologized for the delay. He acknowledged that he sat on the interview because he was afraid of blowback from trans activists. He has acknowledged all of this publicly and has now published our interview. The interview presents a leftist feminist critique of gender identity, and it has the potential to reach millions of American leftists. My hope is that it will do some good and that it will open American liberals' eyes to the harms of gender ideology. Significantly, in my view, he made his piece free to anyone who wants to read it. In contrast, he limits most of his posts to paid subscribers only. Then, just yesterday, he posted a piece responding to the blowback he had gotten for posting a positive review of Walsh's film. That piece is for paid subscribers only, so most of us can't see it. However, a friend sent me some relevant text. The piece begins with this, quote, after publishing a review of Matt Walsh's What is a Woman this week, the expected avalanche of blowback from activists and even a few friends did arrive. Most went straight to the word bigot while others decried platforming a fascist, unquote. He goes on to say the following. The flip side of this phenomenon, however, is more subtle. In my interview with Kara Dansky, when I asked what her definitions of sex and gender were, she said, quote, sex is grounded in material biology. It's what we all learned in school. All human beings are sexually dimorphic mammals. Gender, on the other hand, although the terms are very frequently used interchangeably, is more about sex stereotypes. Women stereotypically like pink, men stereotypically like blue, women stereotypically are nurturing, men stereotypically are aggressive. These are stereotypes that we all have in our minds about what boys and girls are supposed to like, what men and women are supposed to like, and how we're all supposed to act. So that's Taibbi quoting me. And then Taibbi goes on to say this. I hadn't considered the possibility previously because it would be so incredibly stupid if it were the truth. And this is the key part. But what if the cascade of gender fluid rhetoric coming out of academia and pop culture these days isn't about smashing stereotypes at all, but about reinforcing them on a grand scale? Women, we are finally breaking through on the US left. People are starting to get it. We're going to win.
If feminists were able to work with right-wing misogynists like Matt Walsh, who would be using who? How would it further feminists' agenda?
So this is why I really do prefer working with women's organizations when we're working with the right at all. I think the way that it would further our agenda for Matt Walsh to platform us is I really want men like him to understand that they need us if we're going to win. And the only way to persuade them that that's true is to actually be able to have the opportunity to make the point. One of the things I said to Matt Taibbi when he asked me if was I comfortable doing things like going on the Tucker Carlson show, the answer to that question is, of course, largely no. But also I have learned over the course of the past few years that if I can only get platformed by conservative media, I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity to explain to conservatives how they get so much of this wrong, right? Because as everyone knows, it's the Democrats that are pushing this agenda. But in my view, Republicans are not doing nearly enough to stand up to them and to say, stop it already. And so one thing I can do effectively by getting platforms in conservative media is to persuade conservatives that they need to step up and do more if we're going to beat the gender identity agenda. So I have been taking opportunities when I can to do that. The other thing I just wanted to say about working with the right is that we get a lot of very practical and concrete things out of doing that. And so, for example, we are having a rally on June 23rd at the White House to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Part of why we have been able to do that is because we have persuaded some of these conservative women's groups that this has got to be nonpartisan. This has got to be a nonpartisan women's fight to take back Title IX, among other things, for women and girls. And these women's groups, the conservative women's groups, have been persuaded that that's true. And just as an example, I recently went to Pennsylvania, which was considering a bill to protect women's sports in Pennsylvania. And there's a woman with the group Concerned Women for America who's very familiar with the Pennsylvania state legislature. And she was able to secure me some meetings, a handful with Republicans, and that's a useful thing to do. But she also was able to get me a couple meetings with Democrats, with women. And one Democrat woman voted for the Save Women's Sports bill in Pennsylvania, which is a really good thing because they have to hear from us. Because as I said, the Democrats are more likely to be persuaded by someone who calls herself a lifelong Democrat and a feminist than they are by the conservatives. And to the extent that we can persuade the conservatives that that's true, we should keep doing that.
What's the one biggest thing you think UK feminists don't understand about the US situation?
That's interesting. I mean, so this question really that Maureen asked about working with the right, we get a lot of really practical, concrete things out of having spent years forging relationships with them. And I'm not sure if that's always appreciated in the UK. And I guess the other thing I would say is that Americans often get criticism for even our Democrats are much more conservative politically than, for example, UK Labour. I think that's a totally legitimate criticism, and I get it. The other criticism that we frequently get is that Americans have no class analysis. For the most part, we're very attached to our sort of culture of rugged individualism. And I think that's a completely legitimate criticism too. What I think is maybe not always appreciated is that even though radical feminists don't like either of those things, it just is our political reality. And ultimately, we would like to change that. Of course, we would like Americans to have more of a class analysis. Of course, we would like to push our Democrats further to the left. And we will continue doing what we can to do that. And in the meantime, we simply have our political reality that we have to deal with. And if we're going to win within the current political reality, that's just the way it's going to be. And I would love it if UK feminists had an appreciation for that.
So the next speaker we have is Frances Smootz. She is from Germany. She is going to talk to us about an incident with Eva Engelken, and who's in the German Greens, and the latest happenings in Germany. So thank you so much for Frances is the WDI country contact for Germany. Thank you so much for coming on, Frances.
I'll give you an update on what's happening in Germany, and there are 3 different little stories I'll be talking about. First is the incident with Eva Engelken at Stern TV and the consequences that followed. So that's Eva. In Germany, the topic of self-ID has left the social media bubble and is now finally being discussed nationwide. Eva Engelken, a lawyer and Green politician from Mönchengladbach, has made a huge contribution to this and is currently very present in the media, appearing on various TV shows like Stern TV, 13 Questions, or Tag im Hangar, to explain the legal plan and the risks for women and girls. So on June 29th, Eva Engelken was a guest on Stern TV, one of the most influential talk shows on German television. And the topic she was to talk about was transsexuality. Should you be able to change your sex at the registry office without further ado? As an opposing voice, a man named Hannah Corrales, who is a trans activist and self-identifies as a woman, was invited and went first to tell a story freely and without interruption. That's him. You can have a look on Instagram if you like. He told very emotionally about his feelings that already as a little boy, he wanted to be a girl with long hair and play with the other girls, but was not allowed, and that self-ID must come so others wouldn't have to suffer the way he did. Everyone was quite moved by his story and clapped diligently. Then when Eva Engelken joined the group, the mood was quite subdued and quickly turned hostile from the moment Eva started talking. From then on, sweet poor Hannah didn't let her finish one sentence and was supported by the sudden onset of apathy from the moderator. And Edith Stehfest, another woman on the panel, who kept shouting from the other side and tried to invalidate Eva's position for women's spaces with a total crazy argument that women can be raped anywhere anyway, even in women's spaces. During the commercial break, and this is the good part, viewers were asked to participate in a poll. The question was, should everyone be allowed to determine their sex at the registry office? And although Eva barely got through with her arguments, and much to the surprise of the moderator, the following result came out. So 61.3% of 14,000 people who participated were against this very clearly. And the moderator also commented on it that this was, I believe, the highest participation ever they had, with 14,000 people voting. And after the show was over, the tweeting on Twitter began, like always, commenting on all the crap and plus the great poll results. And a day or two later, a comment surfaced from a woman whose overall impression was that the show presented a new kind of witch burning. She sat in the audience that night and observed how the show was being manipulated by the directors. How every time Hannah said something, a clap sign was held up, and not once for Eva. And how the host kept smirking while Eva tried to talk during all the interruptions and didn't bother to intervene. He left that to other guests from the panel. And during the commercial break, a woman in a women's definition t-shirt held up a sign saying no to self-ID, while the host was talking to the group of TRAs, commenting on the action with demos are being held, but showing no further interest in interacting with any of the gender critical women. And after the show, Eva went up to Hannah and Edith. I don't know if she wanted to talk to them, but they immediately went away. And yeah, as Hannah already stated loudly in the show, with such you do not discuss. So on the next day, the Green Party of Mönchengladbach published a statement on the appearance of Eva Engelken at Stern TV, in which they distanced themselves from her because her statements were allegedly transphobic, inhuman, and humiliating. They therefore are now seeking a party order procedure, I hope that's the right word, which could end with her being excluded from the party. Also, she's on a shortlist for a position as a city councillor, which in case she moves up is not allowed to do so as a member of the Greens. So then there was this. On June 1st, appeared a guest contribution on Welt, that's a newspaper, with the title, How ARD and ZDF Indoctrinate Our Children, written by a group of biologists and physicians. The article criticized public broadcasters for using children's and youth programs to spread transgender ideology. In several dozen programs they had watched for research purposes. For example, it was suggested how easy it is to change sex. The gender binarity was questioned, and puberty blockers were presented as safe, but also other topics unsuitable for children were discussed, such as cannibalism or how it is to be raped. Trans, though, was the permanent topic, and critical voices were unwelcome, was the conclusion. And it seemed as if the public broadcaster systematically supported the Greens and the FDP's plans for self-ID. They used the guest contribution to call on the public broadcasters to present biological facts and scientific findings truthfully and to turn away from ideological approaches. 120 scientists, physicians, psychologists, pedagogues had already joined the demand by signing the complaint letter. With the ongoing signature campaign, already lots more followed. So they also presented their 50-page dossier that they had written after watching the many broadcasts, which left them completely shocked after what they had seen. Yeah, you can find it there on that web address. The article in Welt received a lot of media coverage, and over 8,000 people agreed with the article. There were around 2,400 mostly positive comments. And again, lots of tweeting. But of course, there was a lot of hate and agitation from the queers, which strongly directed which was strongly directed against Matthias Döpfner, the CEO of Axel Springer Verlag. Axel Springer is the one who's publishing Welt. So as a reaction to all the hate, he wrote a letter on June 3rd, in which he described the guest commentary as abmissal, condescending, and close to the reactionary attitude describing homosexuality as a disease, with which he of course implies a proximity to right-wing ideas. Nevertheless, he writes, diversity of opinion is important, which is why he supports guest commentaries of all sorts. Later on, he complains that the Axel Springer publishing house has been disinvited from the queer job fair Sticks and Stones taking place in Berlin, even though his company is so LGBTQI, etc. friendly. At the end, he invites Stuart Bruce Cameron, Ulala managing director and organizer of Sticks and Stones job fair, to present a detailed counterposition in Welt. On 10th of June, that was a week later, an interview with Stuart Cameron was published in which he describes how hateful the article was published by the scientists, and that it was published during Pride Month of all things. So under these circumstances, Axel Springer may not be present at Sticks and Stones, he said. Which starts today, by the way. He also felt he was being accused of being against freedom of opinion. For a counterposition, there was allegedly not enough time, but also such form of discrimination was not a basis for a debate, he stated, rejecting the offer. So the next story is just a short one, and yeah, this guy again. So the Green politician Markus Tesser-Ganserer was invited to a podcast called Splitterfasernackt, which translates into totally naked, and I guess is always held in a sauna. And he once again talks about self-ID and the mean trans misogynistic women fighting against self-ID. And I only managed to listen to it for like 5 minutes. And I put this in more, it's more about the pictures and him posing in front of the camera. And he stated he felt totally unwelcome while visiting a women's sauna in the past. And one wouldn't think so, the way he is presenting his body here, and especially here, plus his accessoires. Yeah, and it's just, well, it's the typical reaction as a male politician pretending to be a woman. He was celebrated as stunning and brave, and if you just imagine a female politician doing the same, she would be waving bye-bye to her career. Yeah.
Our next speaker is Stefanie Davies-Arai. She is the founder of Transgender Trend, and then has been awarded last week the British Empire Medal, which is just completely brilliant. So congratulations, Stefanie.
So I heard, you know, something was over a month ago. I got an email. That's so it came completely out of the blue, and it's something that I would never have imagined receiving, you know, in my life, but particularly because I've been working in this area. But what really thrills me is it's a British Empire Medal in the Queen's Jubilee birthday honours list as founder of Transgender Trend for services to children. That's the full thing. And so it's really, really clear recognition that the work that I've been doing with Transgender Trend has been in service of children. So that's massive. It's a huge statement, and to me, it's vindication of my work, obviously, but also all the parents who have turned to Transgender Trend for support when they couldn't find it anywhere else, and it's vindicated their beliefs too. And I think it's vindicated all of us. And I'd say to everybody, please use it in those words, because wherever you can use this, wherever you're, if you're showing your school Transgender Trend schools guide, or you're talking to a clinician about your child, the website is viewed by governments worldwide, governments, health organizations, government departments worldwide, and all sorts of organizations. So it's globally well known, and anything you can use from it, you can now support with the fact that that I have an honour from the Queen for services to children. And I think that's all you need to say when anybody accuses us of being a hate group.
Can you tell us, because some women might not know about it, what sort of pacts do you make, and what sort of arguments do you make in the schools guide and on your website?
They're very simple. The response we get is that they give really practical advice, which is sensible and supports the needs and rights of all students, including pupils who identify themselves as transgender. They're fair. They're within the law. They include evidence. They include testimonies from desisters and detransitioners. They're well balanced, and they include a definition of terms. And so there's nothing that is controversial about the information in our guidance. It also includes, and this is my area, communication. So really, I think really useful things for teachers, like how do you respond when a primary child says, is she really a boy? Then the teacher has to be clear in their response that that's not possible to change into a boy or a girl, but that we support students, and that we treat everybody the same, and that as long as this school does that and supports that child, the school does, the teacher doesn't need to tell lies to another child in order to do that.
So in terms of that, what would you be saying or what do you recommend to teachers, that they would say you can't change sex, but you can break gender stereotypes? Is that or how would you explain it to them?
Actually, little children need very little explanation. The more simple we are, the more they would accept what we say. And we think in this area in particular, because it's been presented to us as so complicated, we think that we have to give children long-winded explanations. We don't. We just say, no, it's not possible to change from a boy into a girl. But some children feel more comfortable being the other one. And we treat them the same as everybody else. Next question, and then they forget about it, and it's just accepted. So we really don't need to sort of overcomplicate this issue for little children. Of course, for secondary children, we have a section on that, and how do we create a culture where the ideas can be critiqued at the same time as having respect for those students who are identifying as trans and non-binary. How do we create that culture where all views are accepted? And it's a challenge for schools when teenagers of that age have very strong need to support social justice causes. Some will have very strong political beliefs. Some, particularly girls, will feel very uncomfortable and not able to say anything. So you have to consider the positions of all students in your school and where they may be coming from.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, but then so if there is some, because we're, Women's Declaration International, we just take quite a hard line. Well, and we say you just can't change sex, and we wouldn't use pronouns. And I suppose the Maya Forstater case in the UK has said we don't have to use pronouns, and we also don't affirm their belief that they've got a gender identity, which, but that it sounds as if you're being a little bit more equivocal about that sort of like allowing, or you're suggesting that in some certain circumstances it's okay to sort of let them say that they're a boy. Let's say it's a girl,
but the children should not be socially transitioned in schools. And I think what we've got now in the UK is the Hilary Cass review into the Tavistock. So that was commissioned by the NHS it was just before the Keira Bell case, actually, but I suspect the NHS Foundation Trust had looked at all the witness statements for the case and seen our side compared to the Tavistocks, and got in first. But they commissioned the review. The interim report came out this year, and Hilary Cass points out that social transition is an active intervention that may have an impact on the psychological development of the child. And teachers should not be intervening in a way that actually is down to the clinical professionals. So in other, social transition in schools is an experiment, and it's a political act rather than an act that recognises this as a clinical condition that we leave to the professionals, because teachers are not qualified to make that decision. So that's not.
That would make quite a lot of difference, because loads of schools in Britain, and I guess, this is applicable to many countries, are going along with social transition and not telling parents sometimes. So yes, that will really help. And how's the reception been? Are you finding that quite a few schools are sort of agreeing, or do you have contact with schools that say, yes, we're doing this?
The feedback has been just overwhelmingly positive, and we know that there are some local authority areas that recommend our pack. So that's despite Stonewall warning everybody against it, that it's deeply damaging. And I hear from parents who take our pack into schools, and the school will say, well, Stonewall says this is deeply damaging, and this is a hate group. And that's why this honour is so important, that they can just come back with this now. Here's proof that they're not. And you can't argue with that.
Yeah, that's really, it's incredibly useful, isn't it, in terms of this sort of building movement to make any speech criticising or questioning this into a hate crime, that we can say, oh, well, I just agree with Stefanie Davies-Arai, MEB, MBE, or
BEM.
BEM. But it does add instant credibility to our criticisms, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's an example. One of my biggest aims from the start was to have open public debate, because if you're not having debate about something that impacts on children, that's a safeguarding risk. Children are put at risk if the adults are not discussing something openly. And so the whole silencing of debate is part. So that for me is that's happened. The debate is happening in public, and once the debate does happen, then you're looking at facts and evidence versus ideology, and that's it becomes very clear that we don't treat children with a political ideology, which we do by calling them transgender. And the Hilary Cass interim report doesn't refer to a transgender child. In other words, she doesn't make an assumption about an outcome or what these children are. She refers to them as children with gender-related distress, or sometimes children with gender dysphoria. And that's an accurate description of these children. Transgender child is an assumption of what they are and what they will remain. So it's a political label, because transgender doesn't actually mean anything. It has no biological, clinical sort of diagnostic term. And children are told it can mean anything you want it to mean.
What how about now and the future? What are you going to do with Transgender Trend, and what are the next steps for us as well in terms of the struggle?
I think that we've we're turning around the tanker. The house of cards is falling down, and the trajectory can only be one way. And everybody needs to take heart, actually, what's happening, not just in the UK, but I think it's signs in other countries as well, that certainly in Finland, in Sweden, in even Australia, France, Florida, are beginning to look at puberty blockers and that medical pathway for children. I think there's an awful lot of damage to undo. And I think, you know, I knew that once we started making gains, the fight back would be even more intense. And that's what we're seeing here at the moment. I think the sort of pushback on the gains we've made. And I always think actually you just have to keep on day by day, taking those steps that you can very easily, when there is fight back, feel like giving up. You know, here's something else. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. You think you dealt with something and something else pops up. And just to actually keep going every day. And I think what Cara said about the sort of hours speaking to this journalist sort of more on the left is really interesting, because now I do so much of my work behind the scenes, and the journey that I've had has been from facing a wall of hostility in whatever situation I'm in, whether I'm talking to policymakers or whether I'm at a conference and speaking out. You can feel the hostility. And from about, I guess about 3 years ago, I started to be listened to respectfully by policymakers. And the results of that work is coming out in ways that I can't divulge, because it's, you know, because I need to continue working with those agencies and individuals. But there's an awful lot of work, I'm sure, as we all know, that goes on behind the scenes in this. It's not necessarily upfront, and to keep going and keep doing it every time. So, for example, we're seeing so much more awful stuff coming into schools as part of relationships and sex education guidance, and we're having to fight that. So the job continues, but I think we can all you know, take heart that things are changing, and they're not necessarily, it's been built up for a long time, and we need to take the steps to just carry on taking those steps to bring it down. And we will be successful because we have reality on our side. And in the end, reality can't be denied. I mean, the ways that we're trying to change reality and fit this in is becoming more and more ridiculous. And one of the ways is babies being breastfed by biologically male people who do not produce breast milk. And I think, you know, at what point are people piqued when babies are being affected by this attempt to deny biological reality? Are there more children confused about their gender now compared to 1990s? Yes, because they're being taught to be. They're being taught in schools that they have a new task of childhood and adolescence, which is to question their gender and explore their gender. And I think that no child needs to do that. Actually, it's like explore your personality. You know, I still don't know the difference between gender identity and personality. To me, personalities have just got a new label. So in, you know, the material in schools that you are on a journey, a gender journey, and you explore your journey towards some, you know, to find out whether you're a boy or a girl, is you know, mentally very harmful, because it separates you from your body. It's a mind-body split, and it's not grounded in reality. It takes children away from reality, but that is what is being normalized and taught to children in schools. And it's not surprising. Gender dysphoria itself as a condition is extremely rare. It's quite normal to sort of think you're or want to be the opposite sex when you're a child. It can be a very normal developmental stage. It can be a result of abuse. It can be all sorts of things on a range of things. But gender dysphoria itself is a very rare condition, and we're creating it we're creating it online, and we're creating it in schools.